Sometimes the most desperate decisions lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. In the forgotten valleys of rural Wyoming, where the vast sky felt both free and cruelly indifferent, one man's final foolish act of compassion would unlock a mystery that had remained hidden for over 30 years. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you love tales of second chances and the amazing bond between equines and humans, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, this story will leave you speechless. Elias Thorne stood in the empty feed room of his barn, staring at the $15 bill in his calloused hand. It was, quite literally, the last remaining money he had to his name. The Teton Valley Credit Union had sent yet another notice that morning, printed in bold, stark red letters that seemed to mock his ceaseless failures. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days, unless he could produce the impossible sum of $15,000. He might as well have been asked to produce a blizzard in August. At 45 years old, Elias had spent his entire adult life trying to keep the Thorne Legacy Ranch alive. His great-grandmother had been a homesteader, establishing this land in the 1930s and building a proud, resilient legacy from nothing but sheer grit and determination. His father, a taciturn man named Alistair, had maintained it through every economic downturn and tough winter. But Elias, despite his relentless effort and the dawn-to-dusk labor that left him permanently aching, was watching 4 generations of family history circle the drain. The relentless drought had begun 4 years ago, transforming his high plains grazing land from sage-dotted green abundance to sun-baked, cracked clay despair. His small herd of Angus cattle had dwindled from 50 head to a paltry 5, and those remaining animals looked as defeated as Elias felt. He'd systematically sold everything that wasn't bolted down or strictly essential for survival. The large diesel tractor was the first to go, followed by his father's custom-made leather workshop tools, then his great-grandmother's collection of historical photographs. Just yesterday, he'd finally parted with his father's old saddle, a piece of art he'd sworn he would pass down to his daughter. His wife, Seraphina, was working grueling double shifts as a practical nurse at the small-town clinic, working herself to the point of exhaustion, trying to keep them afloat. Their 10-year-old daughter, Lila, a fierce and sensitive child, had started skipping her school lunches, telling Elias she simply wasn't hungry, a lie that landed on his heart like a stone, making him feel the profound weight of failing his family. He was failing as a rancher, and worse, he felt like he was failing as a guardian and a husband. The $15 in his hand was the sum total of his last micro sale. A collector in Jackson Hole had paid him a small amount for the saddle, and Elias had immediately spent the rest on emergency fuel for the well pump. This $15 was supposed to be strictly reserved for Lila's school lunch money for the rest of the week, a promise he'd made to Seraphina. Elias carefully folded the bill and slipped it into the breast pocket of his denim jacket. He needed a moment of air. He walked out into the vast, clear September morning. The Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above him, that specific deep cerulean blue that usually brought him comfort, but now only magnified his insignificance. The Gros Ventre Range rose in the distance, their granite peaks already dusted with premature snow, silently indifferent to the human struggles playing out below. His last remaining equine, an aging, dappled grey mare named Dusty, stood in the small paddock near the barn, watching him with an air of profound, almost human understanding. She was 25 years old, far too old for hard work, but Elias kept her because she had been his great-grandmother's favorite mount. Selling Dusty would feel like tearing the last page from his family history, and Elias had already destroyed enough. The weekly regional livestock auction was being held that afternoon in Pinedale, the commercial hub 40 miles away. Elias usually avoided these events. They were a cruel reminder, watching other ranchers make trades and sales, while he had nothing to barter and no funds to spend. But today, he felt an inexplicable pull to go, perhaps driven by the desperate need to be around people who still spoke the language of ranch life. He climbed into his battered vintage Ford truck and made the long, dusty drive. The auction yard sat on the dusty edge of town, a collection of weathered, splintered pens in a cavernous, poorly lit barn that smelled perpetually of hay and regret. Elias arrived as the auction was already in full swing. He leaned against a perimeter fence rail in the outdoor pens, his mind churning uselessly through impossible calculations about saving the ranch. That's when he heard it, a sound so weak and pitiful that at first he dismissed it as the wind, a low, pained whicker coming from the farthest corner of the holding pens. Elias moved toward the sound, picking his way through the maze of sturdy fences and shifting cattle, until he reached the last pen, the one usually reserved for animals that were too sick, too old, or too unwanted to command a proper bid. What he saw there made his chest constrict with a familiar, wrenching combination of anger and profound pity. A young stud foal stood alone in the corner, and Elias had never seen a horse in such desperate physical condition still manage to stand upright. The young horse was male, likely about 5 months old, but looked like a walking ghost, a skeleton loosely draped in dull, patchy brown hide. Every rib showed starkly beneath his matted coat. His spindly legs trembled visibly with the minimal effort of remaining upright. His head hung low, nearly touching the soiled straw, and his large, dark eyes held that glazed, defeated look of an animal that had simply given up. But it was the foal's mane that instantly snagged Elias's attention. It was exceptionally long and thick, matted with burrs, straw, and what looked like months of caked, accumulated dirt and debris. The mane fell far past the foal's knees, an unusual, even bizarre feature that suggested either exceptional specific bloodlines or truly exceptional neglect. Probably both. Elias looked around to see who owned this pathetic, suffering creature. An older man sat nearby on a worn feed bucket, chewing tobacco and looking completely bored by the foal's plight. He was dressed in stained denim work clothes and a greasy black hat that had seen too many decades. "That your foal?" Elias asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. The old man spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt. "Unfortunately, inherited him from my cousin, who decided to move to the city and abandoned his small herd. This one's been nothing but trouble and expense. Can't get him to keep feed down, and I ain't got the time or the heart to nurse him along. He's a lost cause." "What are you asking for him?" The man sized Elias up, clearly recognizing a fellow person at the very end of his financial tether. "I'll take whatever I can get. Was going to sell him to the renderer if nobody wants him by end of day." The renderer. The horse would be summarily destroyed and processed into commercial animal feed. Elias felt a profound, internal twist. He had witnessed too much death and loss on his ranch lately. Looking at this wretched foal, he saw a painful reflection of his own desperate, cornered circumstances, another creature poised on the brink of absolute failure. He thought of Lila, who loved animals with a pure, fierce devotion. He thought of how she'd been so stoic about their sacrifices. "I'll give you $15, Elias heard himself say, the words seeming to materialize out of the dry air around him. $15 he absolutely could not afford to spend. $15 that Seraphina was counting on for Lila's school lunches. $15 that represented his last buffer against utter destitution. But looking at the foal, Elias knew, with an awful certainty, that he couldn't walk away. Maybe it was foolishness, born of his own despair. Or maybe it was the only decent thing he'd contemplated doing in months. The old man's eyes flickered with surprise, clearly not expecting to get anything at all. "Sold, and good riddance. You got a trailer?" "I've got a truck bed," Elias replied, his voice firming with resolve. "He's yours now." The transaction took less than 5 minutes. The old man pocketed the $15 bill with surprising haste, as if terrified Elias might change his mind. Elias led the foal slowly toward his battered Ford. The young horse followed with agonizingly slow, stumbling steps that suggested he might collapse at any moment. Getting the foal into the truck bed required patient, careful maneuvering. Elias fashioned a makeshift ramp from splintered boards he found discarded nearby, and with soft encouragement, the foal finally climbed aboard. Elias secured him gently, careful not to restrict his trembling legs, and tossed a small pile of hay in the corner, though the foal showed no interest in eating. As Elias prepared to leave, the auction manager, an older rancher named Clay Jensen, who had known Elias's father, approached with a clipboard. "Elias, that foal came with some paper. Previous owner never registered him proper, but there's a handwritten note here about his bloodline." Clay handed over a small, wrinkled, heavily stained piece of paper. Elias squinted at the faint, barely legible handwriting. He could make out a few words. Foal. Unknown sire. Possibly from the Saddleback King line. F. Born spring, 2023. The rest was too smudged and faint to read. "Saddleback King?" Elias asked, unfamiliar with the name. Clay shrugged his heavy shoulders. "Doesn't ring a bell with me. Might be nothing, but thought you should have it." Elias folded the paper and stuck it in his breast pocket, next to the receipt for $15, the last evidence of his last money. He climbed into his truck and headed home, the foal swaying slightly in the truck bed behind him. The 40-mile drive gave Elias plenty of time to question his sanity. He'd just spent his daughter's lunch money on an animal that would probably die within days, an animal he couldn't afford to feed. He had no rational explanation for his actions that would satisfy Seraphina. Yet somehow, in the deepest, most exhausted corner of his soul, he felt a flicker of peace. Back at the ranch, Elias carefully unloaded the foal and led him to a freshly cleaned stall in the barn. The young horse moved with painful, slow deliberation. Elias filled a bucket with fresh, warm water and set it where the foal could reach it easily. "I don't know what I'm going to call you, boy," Elias said quietly, running his hand gently along the foal's neck. "But you're safe now. Whatever happens to this ranch, I promise you won't go hungry again." The foal raised his head slightly at the sound of Elias's voice. His dark eyes met Elias's for the first time. In that gaze, Elias saw something he recognized, a desperate, fading will to survive, despite crushing, overwhelming odds. "Jubilee," Elias said suddenly, "a name from his great-grandmother's journal. I'll call you Jubilee. My great-grandmother said that name meant a time of restoration and freedom from debt. Maybe his name will bring us some of that strength." When Seraphina arrived home from her exhausting shift at the clinic that evening, Elias was waiting on the porch, dreading the inevitable conversation. Lila bounded out of the old station wagon first, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. "Daddy!" she called, her voice bright. "Did you get my lunch money?" Elias's heart sank. "Lila, sweetheart, come here. I need to show you and Mama something." He led them to the barn. Seraphina's expression grew increasingly grim as they walked, clearly sensing the profound wrongness of the situation. When they reached Jubilee's stall, Lila gasped, not in delight, but in shock. "Oh, Daddy, he's so skinny. What happened to him?" "I found him at the auction," Elias said quietly, unable to meet Seraphina's eyes. "He was going to be destroyed. I couldn't just leave him." "Elias," Seraphina said, her voice strained, carefully controlled. "Please tell me you didn't spend the last of the cash on him. Please tell me you have money for Lila's school lunch." The silence was her answer. Seraphina closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. When she opened them, Elias didn't see the anger he deserved, but something far more complicated and painful. Exhaustion mixed with profound resignation. "We had just enough for the week," she said softly, clutching the strap of her nurse's bag. "How are we supposed to feed Lila now?" I don't get paid until next week. I'll figure something out, Elias said desperately. I'll pick up day work somewhere. Elias, you can barely keep up with the ranch work as it is. Seraphina's voice cracked slightly, the exhaustion finally winning. I'm working 2 jobs. What more can we possibly do? Lila, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up, her small voice full of a heartbreaking maturity. I can just skip lunch, Mama. I'm not that hungry anyway. My friend Chloe can share her apple with me. The words struck Elias like a physical blow. His daughter, volunteering to go hungry because of his impulsive, costly decision. No, Lila, Seraphina said firmly, immediately moving to embrace her daughter. Absolutely not. You are not skipping meals. She turned back to Elias, her expression softening slightly. We'll make it work somehow. We always do. I know why you did it, Elias. You have your father's heart. You can't stand to see anything suffer. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. Elias felt his throat tighten with guilt and gratitude. I'm sorry, Seraphina. I should have talked to you first. Yes, you should have, she agreed, allowing a faint, rueful smile. She looked at the pitiful foal. But what's done is done. If we're going to keep him alive, we need a plan, and a better name than the $15 mistake. Over the next week and a half, the Thorne family rallied around Jubilee's care with an intensity and purpose that momentarily eclipsed their financial dread. It was a desperate, communal project that temporarily healed the fractures caused by their anxiety. Elias mixed special feeds, combining the last of his scant grain with high-calorie molasses and supplements bought on credit, hoping to spark the foal's appetite. Seraphina used her breaks at the clinic to research complex equine nutrition and rehabilitation online, relying heavily on free veterinary forums and her practical nursing knowledge. Their daughter Lila became Jubilee's most devoted caregiver. Every afternoon after school, she would sit quietly in the clean stall, meticulously doing her homework with the foal's fragile head resting gently near her lap, reading aloud from her school books, or simply talking to him in a soft, soothing voice. She was convinced that her constant, gentle presence helped the foal feel less alone and less afraid. They instituted a grueling schedule of frequent small feedings, waking up every few hours through the night to offer Jubilee small portions of highly palatable mash. They couldn't afford a proper veterinary consultation, so they relied on shared advice from compassionate ranching neighbors and whatever information Seraphina could find online. The transformation was heartbreakingly slow, but undeniably steady. By the end of the first week, Jubilee was consistently drinking water and beginning to tentatively accept his small meals. His dark eyes had regained a measure of clarity, and the visible trembling in his spindly legs had lessened. He still looked like a starved skeleton, but now he looked like a skeleton that possessed a fierce, quiet will to live. Lila became profoundly attached to the foal. "He understands me, Daddy," she told Elias one evening, her hand resting against Jubilee's bony neck. "He knows what it's like to be scared and hungry." Elias's heart ached at the stark truth of her words, a potent reminder of how deeply his financial struggles had marked his sensitive daughter. But watching Lila's gentle, tireless care for Jubilee also filled him with a surge of paternal pride. Despite their hardships, she was learning deep compassion and profound responsibility. 12 days after bringing Jubilee home, Elias decided it was time to properly groom the foal. Jubilee's coat was still patchy and dull, but more critically, his mane was a disaster. The massive, matted, burr-filled mass was heavy, pulling painfully on Jubilee's neck muscles, and Elias worried it might be hiding injuries or deep skin infections. Seraphina and Lila joined him in the barn that Saturday morning, turning the essential, delicate grooming session into a unified family effort. Elias gathered his worn grooming tools, including the sharp, sturdy scissors he normally used for cutting heavy baling twine. "All right, Jubilee," Elias murmured, his voice gentle and low. "Let's see if we can make you feel a little better, boy." He began to work his strong, calloused fingers through the immense, tangled mane. It was worse than he had imagined. Weeks of accumulated debris, sharp burrs, dried mud, and simple, cruel neglect had fused the hairs together into something resembling rough, dried felt. Elias worked meticulously, starting at the bottom and gradually working his way upward, using only his fingers to separate the hairs he could save, and his sharp scissors to carefully cut away sections that were too severely damaged. Lila held Jubilee's lead rope, murmuring softly to him, while Seraphina helped carefully pick out the dozens of painful burrs from the worst sections near his withers. Elias had been working for about 25 minutes when something unexpected caught his eye. Deep within the thickest part of the mane, close to Jubilee's neck, was something that felt distinctly unnatural. It wasn't organic. It felt hard, smooth, and artificial amid the natural debris. "Hold on," Elias said suddenly, his pulse quickening with an inexplicable premonition. "There's something in here, something hard." Seraphina and Lila leaned closer, peering into the dense tangle as Elias worked with extreme care, separating the matted hair around the strange object. As he meticulously pulled away more of the protective, tangled growth, his breath hitched. There was definitely something there, tightly wrapped and deeply hidden within the mane's core, protected by months of accumulated growth and the masterful neglect that had saved it. With trembling, cautious fingers, Elias managed to extract the object. It was a small, heavily aged leather pouch, roughly the size of a child's small fist, tied securely shut with a brittle, rotting leather cord. The pouch itself was heavily stained and aged, but it was clear it had been deliberately and carefully hidden in the mane, likely braided in when the foal was very young. "What is it, Daddy?" Lila whispered, her large eyes wide with sudden excitement and fear. "I don't know, sweetheart," Elias replied, his voice strained and quiet, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He carried the small, heavy pouch out into the stronger light near the wide barn door. Seraphina and Lila followed closely, their shadows stretching behind them in the morning sun. Elias's hand shook noticeably as he carefully untied the fragile leather cord and gingerly opened the pouch. Inside was another layer of protection, a small piece of oilcloth, tightly wrapped around something small and hard. Elias's hands now trembled uncontrollably as he unwrapped the cloth, and what he saw made him literally stagger backward against the doorframe, letting out a choked gasp of pure astonishment. "Oh my God, Elias," Seraphina breathed, her voice a mix of shock and wonder. Inside the cloth lay at least a dozen brilliant loose diamonds. They were loose stones that instantly caught the bright morning sun streaming through the barn window and threw dazzling, fractured rainbow sparkles across the dusty air and the hay-strewn floor. They varied significantly in size, but even to Elias's untrained eye, they appeared to be of exceptional, startling quality. "Are those real?" Lila asked, mesmerized, reaching out a hesitant finger to touch one, before Seraphina gently but firmly pulled her hand back. Elias's mind reeled into chaos. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like them, people on the verge of losing everything. Diamonds hidden in the mane of a starving, derelict foal. It was absurd, impossibly cinematic, the ridiculous plot of a bad movie. But the stones in his shaking hand were undeniably, brilliantly real. He sank onto a nearby hay bale, staring blankly at the diamonds, struggling desperately to make sense of his impossible discovery. Seraphina sat beside him, equally stunned, gently holding his arm. Questions tumbled through his mind faster than he could possibly process them. Where had these diamonds come from? Who and why would hide this fortune in a foal's mane? Were they stolen? Was he now in possession of evidence from some grave, years-old crime? "The paperwork," Seraphina said suddenly, her voice cutting through his panic. "Didn't you say there was some cryptic paperwork with him?" Elias fumbled in his breast pocket, and pulled out the wrinkled, stained paper Clay Jensen had given him at the auction. He read it more carefully now, squinting at the faint, smudged handwriting beneath the mention of the Saddleback King bloodline. At the very bottom, scrawled in a different, hurried hand, were words he hadn't focused on before. If found, contact attorney Julian Kincaid in Cheyenne. Emergency inheritance matter. Highly time-sensitive. Must have proof of foal possession. An attorney. An inheritance. The scattered, unbelievable pieces began to instantly form a bizarre, yet coherent picture. He carefully wrapped the diamonds back in the oilcloth and replaced the pouch in his pocket. They needed to get back to the house. His mind was spinning with equal measures of terrifying possibilities and paralyzing fear. If these diamonds were legitimate, they could solve every one of their problems, and more. If they were stolen or illegal, possessing them could destroy what little security they had left and land them in deep trouble. That evening, after Lila was finally asleep, exhausted by the day's revelations, Elias and Seraphina sat at their worn kitchen table with the old, slow laptop, searching for information about Julian Kincaid, attorney in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It took only a few moments to find him. Kincaid was a senior partner at a prestigious, well-known law firm specializing in complex estate planning and multi-generational inheritance law. "Do we actually call him?" Seraphina asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we even say?" "I don't know what else to do," Elias admitted, rubbing his tired eyes. "If these diamonds are part of something dangerous, we could be in trouble just having them. But the note says to contact this specific attorney regarding an inheritance." Seraphina reached across the table and firmly took Elias's hand. "We'll do this together, Elias. Whatever happens. We just spent our last $15 on him. The risk is already taken." Elias stared at the phone number on the screen for a long, anxious time before he found the courage to dial. It was far past business hours, but the firm's answering service picked up instantly. Elias left a hesitant, tight-voiced message, mentioning the name of the foal, the cryptic note, and the urgent need for a return call from Mr. Kincaid. They spent a sleepless night imagining scenarios: smuggling, organized crime, police raids, or maybe, impossibly, a miracle. The call came at exactly 8:30 the next morning. Elias was in the barn with Jubilee and Lila when his cheap cell phone rang, showing a Cheyenne area code. Seraphina, too anxious to concentrate, had called in sick to her clinic shift and rushed out to the barn the moment the phone rang. "Mr. Thorne, this is Julian Kincaid. I received your extraordinary message last night, and I must tell you, I have been desperately searching for that foal for over 4 months." The attorney's voice, though professional, carried an undeniable note of profound relief and extreme urgency. I don't understand," Elias managed to stammer out, his voice shaking uncontrollably. Seraphina moved immediately to his side, straining to hear the conversation. "Mr. Thorne, this is a rather delicate and highly complex situation," Kincaid continued. "Would it be absolutely possible for me to drive out to your ranch and meet with you today? I can explain everything in person. Crucially, I will need to verify certain details about the foal and what exactly you found." They arranged to meet that afternoon. Elias spent the intervening hours in a state of paralyzing, anxious anticipation. The weight of the diamonds, still locked away in his desk, felt heavier than the ranch's debt. He was holding a secret that could either save his family or destroy them. Julian Kincaid arrived promptly at 2 p.m., driving a gleaming black sedan that looked absurdly opulent against the backdrop of Elias's deteriorating ranch. The attorney was in his late 60s, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit, yet his demeanor was surprisingly warm and professional, entirely lacking in condescension. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne," Kincaid said, shaking their hands with a firm grip. "And you must be Lila. Thank you for seeing me. May I see the foal and the item you found?" Elias led him immediately to the barn, his family trailing closely behind, the three of them united by a nervous anticipation. Jubilee stood in his stall, looking significantly better than he had a week ago, though still clearly underweight. Kincaid approached the stall and studied the foal with an intensity that suggested he was comparing what he saw to a detailed mental image. "The mane has been trimmed," Kincaid observed gently. "Yes, sir. It was badly matted." "That's when we found the pouch," Elias replied, handing the small leather pouch, which he retrieved from his locked desk drawer, to the attorney. Kincaid opened it carefully, examined the dazzling diamonds, and then nodded slowly with profound satisfaction. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne, I need to tell you a story. It begins 32 years ago with a man named Lord Alistair Thorne." Elias and Seraphina exchanged a stunned glance. Thorne. Alistair Thorne was not just a successful Wyoming rancher, he was a fabulously wealthy, almost eccentric horse breeder, an international diamond merchant who made his fortune selling stones across Europe before returning here to retire. He was my client and my friend. He founded this ranch, not your line of the Thornes, but a related family branch. Sadler settled onto a hay bale, and the Walker family gathered around, Lila sitting close to her mother. Even Jubilee seemed to be listening from his stall. Alistair had one child, a daughter named Cassandra. She was his pride and joy, and inherited his passion for horses. When Cassandra was 25, she fell deeply in love with a local horse trainer Alistair despised. He cut her off, and in a terrible falling out, Cassandra left, cutting all ties with her father. Alistair spent the next 30 years trying desperately to find his daughter, but Cassandra had effectively disappeared, hiding herself and her life deep in the mountain territories. Elias and Seraphina squeezed hands, their own fear of failure amplified by the pain of this family estrangement. Alistair passed away 10 months ago, at the age of 87. His estate was monumental, valued at approximately $20 million, Kincaid stated, pausing for effect. Seraphina gasped audibly. In his final will, Alistair left absolutely everything to Cassandra if she could be located within 1 year of his death. If not, the estate would be dissolved and distributed to his chosen charities. Kincaid looked directly at Jubilee. "I've been searching for Cassandra for 10 months with no success, until your call." "I don't understand what this has to do with Jubilee," Elias whispered. 4 months ago, I received an anonymous, frantic call from a woman who claimed to be Cassandra. She said she'd been living under a different name in remote Idaho, that she and her husband ran a small, struggling horse operation. She said she'd heard about her father's death and the inheritance, but she was dying of a rare, aggressive illness, and critically, she was too proud and too emotionally scarred to come forward herself. However, she wanted her own young son to inherit what was rightfully theirs. She said she had put a marker on the inheritance. Kincaid pulled out a photograph from his leather briefcase. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her late teens, standing beside a dappled grey mare and a newborn foal. This photo was mailed to me after that phone call. The woman on the phone said her son had moved away years ago and she couldn't contact him directly, but she had placed this marker, the diamonds, in the mane of a foal born to her best mare, a foal she knew carried the most potent genes of the Saddleback King line, Alistair's most prized stallion. "The diamonds in Jubilee's mane," Seraphina finished, her voice flat with disbelief. "Exactly. Cassandra said she had braided the diamonds into the mane of the designated foal, along with the note directing the finder to contact me. She believed the foal would eventually be sold and end up in the hands of someone who would care for him properly, someone compassionate, and that person would find the key." "But why such a risky, complicated method?" Elias asked. Kincaid smiled sadly. "My addition for complexity. Because Cassandra, in her last days, was driven by both immense love and immense anger. She didn't want the estate. She wanted to prove her father wrong about his lifelong judgment of her character. She knew Alistair had dedicated his life to preventing his money from falling into the wrong hands. by forcing the inheritance to pass through an act of selfless compassion, by requiring a true act of charity and love for an animal. She ensured the money would go to someone who embodied the values her father had failed to see in her life. The money was meant to reward a good heart, not greed. So, these diamonds, Elias began, still struggling to grasp the numbers, are genuine, worth approximately $400,000. But they are, primarily, a key. They are the proof that the holder has custody of the horse that Cassandra designated. Precisely. And according to the terms I agreed to during that final anonymous phone call, whoever saved this foal and found the diamonds is entitled to a reward of $1.5 million for their compassion and care, payable immediately, Kincaid announced. The number hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. Seraphina made a small, choking sound. Lila, sensing the monumental shift in the atmosphere, stared intently at her parents. But there's more, Kincaid continued. The foal himself, according to a DNA testing kit we'd secretly distributed to several horse sales and completed based on samples from Alistair's preserved bloodlines, is indeed descended from the Saddleback King. His genetic lineage makes him incredibly valuable as a breeding stallion, potentially worth another $200,000 in stud fees over his lifetime. Elias could only shake his head. Seraphina was openly crying, overwhelmed by the news that their world had just been saved by a $15 mistake. Kincaid smiled gently. "Mr. Thorne, you spent your last $15 to save this animal's life. Cassandra designed this inheritance to reward exactly that kind of impulsive, selfless compassion. You didn't know about the diamonds when you bought him. You saw a suffering creature, and despite your own dire circumstances, you chose to help. You and your family nursed him back to health when you could barely afford to feed yourselves. That's the kind of person Alistair's daughter wanted to succeed her. Someone who values life over profit. My addition for the $15 payoff. That $15 bought your family a legacy." "What about Cassandra's son?" Seraphina asked, finally finding her voice. "Doesn't he inherit the main estate?" "We are still searching for him," Kincaid admitted. "He is the ultimate heir, and we have until the 1-year deadline to locate him. But Cassandra's instruction was clear. The person who saved the marked horse was to be rewarded immediately. Your reward is separate from that." Kincaid opened his briefcase and withdrew several legal documents. "These papers transfer ownership of the diamonds to you and establish your $1.5 million reward. I'll need your signatures." Elias signed with a hand that shook less from fear and more from sheer disbelief. Seraphina signed beside him. When the paperwork was complete, Kincaid handed Elias a business card. "I'll begin the liquidation of the diamonds and establish your bank account. Within 30 days, you'll have access to the full amount. In the meantime, if you need immediate funds—" "The foreclosure," Elias said, the word suddenly regaining its horrifying reality. "The bank is starting proceedings in 3 weeks. We need $15,000. Consider it done, Mr. Thorne. I will personally deliver a cashier's check to the Teton Valley Credit Union tomorrow morning." Kincaid stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne, you saved more than a horse today. You saved the essence of what Lord Alistair Thorne spent 30 years trying to protect, and you taught your daughter values that are, perhaps, the most valuable legacy of all." After Kincaid left, the Thorne family sat together in the barn with Jubilee for a long, quiet time, trying to absorb the sheer, dizzying magnitude of what had just happened. "Daddy," Lila said quietly, hugging Jubilee's neck gently, "does this mean we don't have to be scared anymore?" Elias felt tears of relief streaming down his face. "No, sweetheart, we don't have to be scared anymore." Seraphina wrapped her arms around both Elias and Lila. "You know what this means," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It means you did the right thing, Elias, even when it seemed absolutely crazy. It means your great-grandmother's name on this foal brought us more than just good luck." The next day, Kincaid's promised check arrived by courier, and Elias immediately paid off the mortgage. Over the following months, the Thorne family transformed their lives. Elias bought back the land and the equipment he'd sold. Seraphina quit her night shift. Lila got new school clothes, and more importantly, got to spend more time with her parents, who were no longer exhausted from constant worry. Jubilee, with proper nutrition, veterinary care, and the devoted attention of the entire family, transformed into a magnificent young stallion. His coat gleamed, his frame filled out, and his famously long mane became his signature feature. Elias established the Thorne Kincaid breeding program, a small, selective operation dedicated to preserving the Saddleback King bloodlines, with all proceeds going toward equine rescue and rehabilitation. On a warm spring morning, 3 years after Elias found Jubilee, the ranch held an open house for the local community. Lila, now a confident 13-year-old, decided she wanted to become an equine veterinarian. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd kept that $15 for lunch?" Seraphina asked, watching the crowd. Elias wrapped his arm around his wife. "Every day, Seraphina, and every day I'm grateful I made the choice I did. That $15 bought back our future, our security, and our ability to teach Lila that doing the right thing matters, even when it costs you everything." Jubilee lowered his magnificent head, and Elias rested his forehead against the stallions, a gesture they'd shared countless times. "Thank you, boy," Elias whispered, "for everything. For teaching us that miracles still happen. For reminding us what really matters.